Hey guys, so today I want to share with you some tips on self-sufficiency and things that we can learn from the Great Depression. Now, this might sound a little bit funny coming from me, but my dad was actually raised through the Great Depression. And really their way of life didn't change much after the Great Depression ended. They had to be self-sufficient, and pretty much if they didn't raise it themselves on most things, then they simply wouldn't eat. Going to the store and buying things. There was no unemployment back then. There weren't a lot of the programs that we have now. And life was definitely different. But in my dad's words, it was a hard life, but it was a good life. And so I'm going to share a lot of the tips that I have been raised with and that he practiced when I was growing up, things that we practice here on the homestead. And while we might not be able to do everything that's on this list, most of us can do at least a few things and begin to put more into practice. So the first step on my list, and by the way, if you want to hear this live interview that I did with my dad, I tried to get him to come on video and he wasn't comfortable with that, which is totally fine. But if you want to hear the interview with him actually telling the stories and the live account from someone who lived through it, I will have the link below and you can go on the website to the blog and you can actually listen into it or you can read the transcript. It's really fun. But I'm going to kind of encapsulate and share a lot of things that we're doing here from those tips already on our homestead. So first up, behind me, can you hear them? They're pretty noisy this morning. It's chickens. So having some type of livestock obviously is going to be really good, and one of the best is chickens. The reason for chickens is because you get some type of food for them almost every day. Now in the winter months, we don't use a heat lamp. We don't force our chickens to lay through the winter. So I don't get a lot of eggs, but I'm actually able to pretty much preserve the eggs I get during the glut time right now so that I still have eggs in the winter months when they're not laying and I don't have to buy any from the store. But the reason I say chickens is the first type of livestock is because you're getting that daily source for most of the year of food from them in the form of protein and fat, which is obviously in your egg. And then if need be, you can butcher some of your flock if you actually need the actual meat from the chicken. Though I don't do that with my laying hens. We have our meat chickens for our meat birds. But having that daily source of eggs, and we can use that in so many other things, I think is a really key thing. So we actually use a chicken tractor, so I pull this all around the field, so they help to fertilize the field and they get fresh grass every day. But I don't free range because we have way too many predators and it'll wipe a flock out. And now it's time to get my daily reward, which is the eggs. So here is my bounty. So aside from the chickens for, of course, our bounty of eggs, and then also as a meat source, the other thing that my dad said was really essential for them, and he came from a pretty big family. There was quite a few kids. Of course, he's second to the oldest, so obviously the older he got, the more kids they had. But that was having a milk cow, because if you've got a milk cow, you obviously have milk. But that's not just milk. I mean, milk is great, but it's kind of all the other things that you get when you have milk. So you've got your butter, you've got your cream, hallelujah, the cream and the butter are my favorite parts. But then you can turn that into your yogurt and your sour cream, and then of course all of your cheeses. So, oh my goodness, we won't even list out all of the cheeses, but obviously there's a ton that you can make. So I'm so excited. My husband actually gave me the okay and the go ahead. We are making plans to get a milk cow. Now I have no idea how fast that's going to happen. We have to get a dairy cow. We don't have a dairy cow. We have beef cattle, which having your own beef source, be it meat chickens or pigs or cattle, is great because you really don't get a ton of fat off of chickens. So if you have pigs, which we are picking up our pigs in another week, then when you butcher, you get lard. So that's great because we need fat sources. And during the Great Depression, they weren't going and buying their coconut oil like I do now, or my avocado oil. or even my butter from the store, you pretty much had to raise it yourself or you weren't going to get any, at least the way that my dad was raised and they grew up. So they had the lard from the pigs, and then of course from the cattle you get the tallow, which you can use somewhat in cooking, but usually that's more for soap making. Your lard is really your cooking fat that's the best, and you can use in baking and doesn't have a strong flavor like you get with the tallow and the beef. So there's that. But I am so excited about getting the dairy cow, you guys. I can't even hardly put it into words and contain it. So having livestock with fat sources, of course, and the eggs was definitely a must, and a dairy cow was really big for them. And then self-sufficiency, we got to talk about the garden. The garden was really what fed them the most through the winter months. And pretty much all of us, no matter where you live, there's some type of food that you can be growing yourself, even if it's on a patio, even if it's in containers, if it's just in a back porch, a small portion of your yard. Well, you might not be able to grow enough food to take you through an entire year, which you can watch my garden tour and I show you everything that we grow. I just did that spring garden tour that was just a week ago, so I'll make sure and link to that so you can catch it. But I'm out in our main vegetable garden right now, and then I've got the high tunnel and the other ones behind me. But there's a lot that you can raise yourself. But the crops that my dad and them used the most with, and this is what really fed them through the winter months, was their beans. So right here are my little baby pole beans that just sprouted this past week, and we're going to be trellising them this year on these panels. Really excited to try that method, and you can see more about the construction and the size of that in that garden tour video. But beans were one of their really big staple crops. And the reason for that is because here in the Pacific Northwest, where they migrated from North Carolina when my dad was little and raised their family, beans grow really well in this cool and wet climate. We don't typically have summers that are super hot for a very long extended period of time. So the beans will flower and set fruit all summer long, which means you're getting your beans. So both a green bean, and then they also did a shelled bean. And one of the reasons is during Great Depression times, and honestly, when you're being self-sufficient, you're not running to the store, you're not having fresh vegetables year round. We do some winter growing here where I use microclimates and hoop houses so that I can grow things like lettuce and some of those cool hardy things almost year round. But back then they didn't have greenhouse plastic, right? So let's be real. They weren't doing a lot of what we're even able to do now during these times. Back then, they just simply didn't have the money to buy those supplies, or the supplies just didn't exist like they do now. So they were not having fresh vegetables or fresh fruit except when it was in season and they could grow it themselves. So during the spring and the summer and the fall months, that was very variable as to obviously what was in season. You're having strawberries in the early part of summer, and then you weren't going to have them again until the next year, unless you had preserved them up. So the expectancy during the Great Depression of what meals looked like and what people were eating is very different than it is today. We're really spoiled and thinking we need to have specific fresh vegetables and fresh fruit and all of this stuff, which is great from a calorie and a nutritional standpoint. I get that. But it's also a very realistic expectation when you were going through the Great Depression or really hard times, or wanting to live off of what you were able to produce on your land. You're obviously most climates are not going to be able to do that. So the majority of what they ate was green beans. That was their vegetable, canned green beans that they put up for the winter months. And then the shelled beans, and that could provide some protein as well as a lot of calories when it comes to vegetables. So obviously there's the preserving the harvest. And so my grandma did a ton of canning. Canning and dehydrating was the main way, because they didn't have refrigeration and they didn't have freezers, that they put up all of their food to take them through the winter months. But then they also had to do they didn't really buy a lot of feed. So whatever they were feeding the livestock, they were either growing grains themselves. Very little table scraps existed because they really didn't have a lot of excess to eat. And my grandma really cooked because they didn't have the means of refrigeration, at least where they lived in the cabin they were growing up in. There wasn't electricity, so they didn't have a refrigerator, and they didn't have a lot of even the convenience things that we do. So my grandma would buy in bulk cornmeal, flour, and sugar and salt. And that was pretty much the majority of it. And so she didn't even do a lot of bread baking because, one, that took a lot of extra time, and when you are providing for a family and you have all those farm animals and everything, and you're relying on that for your survival, she didn't even use the time to bake bread very often. They did cornbread and biscuits because she could make up exactly enough biscuits that it would feed everybody at dinner time or at breakfast. I mean, they were cooking all of their meals from scratch, 3 squares a day. There was really not much snacking that happened like we do now. And the food was very basic. So most of the time it was beans with a side of either cornbread or biscuits, as I shared. Very rarely was it bread. A real treat was to do rice pudding, which was something that my grandma actually did have to buy. But most of the time, and this is another tip from the Great Depression, people didn't really have money. But if you had, you know, your own livestock, you had your eggs, she had her dairy, she had the butter. I've got a lot of tomatoes that are growing in my high tunnel. But if you had those types of things, you could do bartering. And so she would take and trade for things at the store. She would give them fresh eggs. They didn't necessarily have it. And then she could get some rice. And so rice pudding was like a really special treat. Now, how many of us today think that rice pudding is really something amazing and a special treat? Probably not a whole lot of us, unless you just have a fondness for that particular food. There was a lot of stews. So hunting, of course, was one way, and fishing. So you could get fish from the river. They lived near a river and a creek, so there was fishing, and then hunting when you're lucky enough to get venison. And they had their beef cattle. So they raised beef cattle the same as we do. And that way, if you didn't get lucky, if you know it was a scarce game year or whatever, at least you had your cattle. So you had your beef. So they always had a type of meat, but it was usually meat, and they also raised pigs, so there was pork, but there was your meat, which they did a lot of salt curing. And when my dad was growing up, there was actually 3 miles away, there was a store that had refrigerated lockers, and you could rent a part of that so they could keep some of their meat there, but they didn't have means other than salt curing to keep it, and canning, which is why they did so much canning. My grandma canned most of the things because of lack of refrigeration to make it last. Here in the Pacific Northwest, our winters aren't typically cold enough to actually hang your meat like it is in some of the eastern states or the more northern states, where they would butcher in the fall, and then they had where they could, you know, freeze it, or it would stay cold enough and act as like natural refrigeration. We're too up and down here in the Pacific Northwest. We do get some cold, but a lot of it is we'll get cold and then we'll warm up. We'll get cold and then we'll warm up. So it's just not really consistent for us to store our meat that way, which is why they used those lockers. But the majority of their meals was some type of meat, and then it was a bean, like usually some of the green beans or the shelled beans, and then a cornbread and or a biscuit. And a lot of times it was like soups and stews, because you can really stretch. Plus you've got the broth, which helps to fill you up. But you can really stretch or odd in vegetables and smaller amounts of meat if you're doing a soup or a stew to feed a large amount of people. And so they had a lot of soup beans and a lot of cornbread. And it was a lot of times the same food day in and day out. So pickiness really wasn't going to get you very far. Now, as far as gardening, you do have options. I shared this tunnel in my last video, but I know a lot of people are like, well, I don't have the space and I really need to grow. And of course, they didn't have these towers or a lot of containers like this to plant in during the Great Depression, but this can be a great way to grow a lot of food if you don't have a lot of in-ground space. And you're trying to use just the space that you have on a patio or a deck, because you can go 5 tiers high with a vertical planter like this. And of course, you can see I have got my herbs in here. This is holy basil, and then I've got my strawberries, which look at those, you guys. Woohoo! First strawberries, I'm super excited, coming on quick. If you're interested in this, I have a link. I'm an affiliate for them, and you can get a coupon code to get that off, and you can check out those, and I'll put that in the video description below. So as I shared, during the Great Depression, the biggest forms of food preservation that they used was canning and dehydration, at least for my family. So one of the things is they would can up, I have venison here, venison and beef. And the great thing is it makes this natural broth. I do a raw pack, which is totally safe to do when pressure canning only, but you cube the meat, you put it in raw, you do not add liquid, and you pressure can it for the specified amount of time for your altitude and the food inside. In this case, it's venison. And we pretty much, anytime we get venison, except for the back strap, I can all of my venison. I don't even put it into the freezer. We just can it up. The great thing is it makes this wonderful broth. And so I can just dump this into a pan, heat it up, add a little bit of thickener at the time to make a quick gravy, because you don't want to can with flour or cornstarch or those other thickeners. They're not approved for canning and can cause safety issues. and then just make a quick side of biscuits and throw in a jar, not in the same pan, but heat up a different pan or pot of green beans, and we have a full meal there. So that is really great on busy nights when you're busy and you still want home cooked. But this was also, those were the majority of the meals that in fact, my dad's favorite thing still to this day is canned beef or canned venison. He loves the texture and the flavor. It's very tender, so that's a great thing. One of the other things that my grandma used is, of course, during the Great Depression and even further back, she would can a lot of their fruit into jams and jellies, and usually jam, because to do jelly, you have to extract the juice from the fruit, and that's another step and more work. And so I rarely make jelly. Most of the time I'm doing jams. This is strawberry jam, and during the Great Depression, and actually for my grandma's entire life, you don't use store-bought pectin. Store-bought pectin wasn't something that was readily available, and if it was available, it was an expense that they just didn't have the money to spend on it. So all of the ways that my grandma canned her jams, and I do as well, is without store-bought pectin. So strawberry and apples, those were biggies, blackberries around here, and blueberries, and so they would can up their jam. Now, and if you want the recipes on how to still safely can, you don't have to have, it's not a safety issue when you're using pectin, it just helps to get it to set. But if you want to get the recipes that only use fruit and are low sugar, they do have some sugar. It's really hard to get to a gelling point if you don't use any sugar. So I do use some sugar, but it's a lot lower when you're using natural pectin sources and not store-bought. You don't have to use as much sugar in order to reach that gelling point, which is fabulous. I've got this particular low sugar, no store-bought pectin strawberry jam recipe. I'll link to it below, and I've got a lot of other ones. Now, the other form that they used besides canning was dehydrating. And of course, my grandma didn't have a electric dehydrator like a lot of us do in our homes now. And so she would have to spread things out on screens or out on porches and sunny, hot areas and be able to get them to dry. But this is dehydrated blueberries from our blueberry plants. And so I do some dehydrating after I've canned up my fruits. I like to do a lot of other canning though. Like here I've got, so this is our pears, and I do the same thing with peaches. And this is, oh my goodness, guys, pears are one of my absolute favorites. I might like them even more than apples, but I am a happy camper just to sit and eat pears like this. And I do a really, really light syrup. I don't do just water because a small amount of sugar is going to help preserve the color, and it just keeps them looking better on the shelf. But I use a very small, tiny amount. And if you want to learn more about canning, I have got a free pressure canning series. So if you're looking to do vegetables and meats, you definitely want to go through that. It's a 4-part video series. I'll link to it below. I also have a full canning course that has over 65 of the recipes that I use to can up over 400 jars of food a year. We're increasing that this year, doing a lot more pickling and tomatoes and all of the wonderful ways that we can safely can up our food. And I also have a home fruit canning course, which shows you how to do fruit to jar without using those store-bought pectins and doing low sugar from things like your pie filling. So I have got some blackberry pie filling right here, to your fruit butters, to your jams, to your jellies, and of course just canning your fruit half or whole, where it's just the fruit in the jar, as well as syrup. I've got some blueberry syrup down here, a small amount left from last year, so I'm really looking forward to all of the harvest coming on to replenish our shelves. One of the other things that my dad talked about during the Great Depression is entertainment. So they didn't have money for entertainment. There were movies, of course, and stuff back there, but they didn't have the money for gas and the travel or to buy the entertainment, and they didn't have electricity, but they had cards, a few board games, and the radio. So they loved to listen to the radio and the radio shows, and they would all be really, really quiet and listen to the shows when they came on. And those were pretty much the only forms of entertainment that they had, other than just playing, with one another when you had a large family. So if listening to things like the radio, definitely check out the Pioneering Today podcast, and specifically the episode where I actually interview my dad, and you can hear more about his life account of growing up and going through the Great Depression and what that was like, including outhouse and no indoor plumbing and different ways that they used to do like mock refrigeration without having a refrigerator for some of the different foods. So highly encourage you to check out that. I would love to help you get started with your canning as well. And beneath the video is the links to all of the different things that I talked about, including my biscuit recipe. Because I don't know about you, but after listing out and walking through all of this, I am suddenly very, very hungry and ready to go whip up some food.